do you watch soccer or Olympics? What's your main sport of interest?
Main sport of interest, I would say I do watch the Olympics with my family, particularly the Winter Olympics. My dad watches soccer, so I always grew up with that around the house. But we're a really big hockey family, so that's why we love the Winter Olympics, and we always watch hockey specifically.
Can you just state your name, grade, and major?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Katya. I am a junior here at Cal, and I'm an economics and statistics major.
Very cool. So blood and so in China, the Olympics was held. So yeah, Winter Olympics was held in China, and they have a laundry list of human rights violations. But there's still this huge demand for these international sports showcases. So how can we address the supply of these sports being held in awful regimes with the love of the sports? As you said, you watch it with your family.
I think that's interesting. Honestly, I don't really know how the Olympic Committee votes on selecting which venue to hold these sporting events at, particularly Winter and Summer Olympics. But I think there should be more regulations and some more, in general, maybe certain benchmarks that countries have to meet in order to be able to host such events. It's definitely an issue, I think, for fans as well in certain regimes to go out and see these events if the country that is hosting these events isn't particularly friendly. So, for example, quick example in Russia, for example, Russia's not a super LGBTQ friendly nation. A lot of Eastern European countries are not. That makes it difficult for fans who are in that community to show up and have a safe time participating and attending these events. So potentially looking at having more control from the International Olympic Committee to make sure that only countries who are welcoming and willing to host these events, but also make sure that they are protecting everyone regardless of their identity.
I mean, this is a great point that it should be the Olympics that decides and should have these benchmarks in place. So but these benchmarks are more from countries, usually Western countries with these that have the more respect for these human rights. How can these? I guess it would be the largest donors to the Olympics would have the largest sway, and one of those is China. So how do you contend with that?
That is true. I think Western countries definitely face then a dilemma of whether or not to send their sports teams to such countries. Definitely very difficult considering the Olympics are an event where everyone does want to show up for them, of course. So I think it's up to Western countries to decide what they value more at the end of the day, and that's the safety and comfort of their own people showing up to these events versus the money and all of the revenue that they would generate from participating in such events.
I mean, that's a great point. And it also goes back, because, I totally agree that it should be the Olympic Committee that's in charge of this. But there is also that individual boycott. So Belarus and Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, were totally blocked out from FIFA and other international leagues. Do you think we should further this to China and Qatar? Like, what makes what Russia and Belarus did different from Qatar and China?
That's interesting. The conflict in Ukraine is definitely a difficult matter in that it is much more spoken about in contrast to a lot of other similar issues in other parts of the world, which again shows the disparity between caring about issues that are happening in Europe and issues that are happening in other parts of the world. Hence, it would be good to consider looking more into what exactly is happening in China and Qatar and considering whether or not they should be banned from certain international sports organizations. I think there needs to be more attention about this. I think Western countries should pay more attention to, in general, what is going on in other parts of the world. Right now, Ukraine is very prevalent, but I think as time passes, there should be more focus on other parts of the world. And if need be, I think that Western countries should consider, and other countries in the world should consider potentially cutting out countries that have been problematic in the past from international sports organizations.
Very, very good point. So how do you feel about nationality in sport? We've seen a lot of U.S. Born and raised and trained in the United States competing for China, or Italian Americans that have also done the same. How do you feel in nationality that the sport, the skiers, how do you call them? Olympic athletes, there we go. The athletes can pick and choose and decide for which country they will compete for?
Yeah, that's a difficult question in that I think nationality is something that is binding in a sense, but also, again, with a lot of examples that do exist. Not all athletes necessarily compete for their nationality. Instead, they compete for the certain country that they're a citizen of. One example of this, which doesn't necessarily have to do with the Olympics, really, the National Hockey League, for example. Most of the National Hockey League is not made up of American hockey players. It's made up of a lot of international players from Eastern Europe. There's a lot of players from Canada, things like that, and they all go back to participate in the Olympics for their home countries. So that's kind of an interesting scenario in that they spend most of their time in the United States, and eventually have families there, things like that, but end up going back to compete for their own home countries. So in that sense, nationality is fairly important to people like that. And I think it does provide a sense of pride, but also at the end of the day, nationality is not as binding, in my opinion, as we oftentimes consider it to be. So personally, my own thoughts on it are that whatever athlete is a citizen of whatever country, regardless of their nationality or origin, should be allowed to compete in what country they feel that they are willing to support the most.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Juliet. I'm a business and data science major, and I'm a junior.
Very cool. Did you watch the Olympics?
I did watch some of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, but not very closely.
Fair enough. Are you first gen?
First gen American, yes.
Okay, very cool. So in the Olympics and also in FIFA, there has been, particularly in this latest Winter Olympics, there have been a lot of American-born Chinese, American-born Italians that have grown up in the United States, have been trained here, but then competed for China and Italy. How do you feel about nationality in international sports like this?
In my opinion, for international sports like this, I think, being a first-generation American and having kind of ties to two countries, I think there's kind of like a gray area in which, you are tied to one country and another country, and just because you grew up somewhere, it doesn't mean you really feel like, representing the country you represent also kind of is like, a double agent in how that country represents you. Like, if I were to play a sport, I would want to feel like if I were representing a country, I would want to feel that that country I was playing for represented me.
That's a great point. And then, so that is about the dual citizen. How do you feel about in FIFA and in the World Cup that some countries would give citizenship to players just so that they can play on their team?
I think that having it kind of be for that like sole intention of just having them on the team, kind of, I see where that would like draw some concerns, because it draws the question of if it weren't for the sport, would you be wanting that citizenship as well? It kind of poses a question like, is this genuine? Like, do you I feel like it could be kind of seen as like not true. Like, I can see where that could raise some concerns, but I do think it is also like valid in that that would be kind of a motivator to get you to get citizenship.
I see. Oh, that's an interesting point that no one else has brought up. So the FIFA World Cup is being held in Qatar, and the Winter Olympics was in China, two countries that have had a laundry list of human rights violations. There's this huge demand for these international sports showcases. So how can we address the supply by these regimes, yet with our love for the sports?
That's a good point. I actually had a assignment about this for my ethics and business class that that kind of asked how involved like government and businesses should be, like in terms of like the Olympics, like if by the U.S.'s involvement in the Olympics, is it like kind of perpetuating these human rights violations and like making it seem like they're okay?
Right.
And the big issue is that, well, something that I talked about for this assignment is that like by streaming and because the host countries do benefit a lot from like hosting the Olympics, and so do a lot of companies from between sponsorships and broadcasting and everything. And I think it is very problematic if it's not addressed like throughout the programming, because it kind of paints something in a certain light versus if it's not being talked about, it kind of gets overshadowed by the Olympics instead of talking about the actual issues.
That's a great point. Yeah, I had a friend, because I brought this up with a friend, and they mentioned that in everything in our life, everything we buy, everything we do has this, is, a lot of it is made in China or Bangladesh or in Qatar, where these human rights violations, so we still on a daily basis are okay with this, or not okay, but we still, pay with our pockets. But just the Olympics and FIFA brings it right into our face and says, this is what you're doing. But yeah, with your point, it's a good one. So also in sports teams, so in the Olympics a little different. I mean, we could also say, the countries that support the teams have, make money from blood, and also the owners of sport teams. So like Qatar and the UAE has also purchased teams in Europe with oil and blood money. How can we separate the watching of the sport from these owners? That, like the countries in the Olympics, there is a big, they get a lot of benefits, but owning the team gives a huge benefit to the owners.
Yeah, I think that is what is kind of difficult, is there is no way to really, you either like watch the sport or you don't, and and it's difficult for like for spectators to kind of like be able to combat that. I feel like it would have to be something like within the actual like ownership and business within the teams that has to like kind of be worked out. Like it's just, that is the thing, like they are so connected that they both like they're just too connected in order. It's a difficult situation. I don't know what I would recommend for that.
So it's on the businesses.
Yeah.
So this goes back to corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
On that, yeah, they know of these human rights abuses. So we saw this with Belarus and Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Huge amounts of companies have now, a lot of them technically or temporarily suspended their operations in Russia, but have also just come out and rejected being in Russia. So how can we try to get that same urgency of the invasion of Ukraine to other human rights violations?
That's a really interesting point. A lot of people have been talking too about the differences between the response to the invasion of Ukraine versus other conflicts going on in, for example, Middle Eastern countries that don't have the same publicity or like public reaction as in Ukraine, and a lot of that comes from our just the traction that it needs to get from people in power, and lead it, like when companies do make those decisions to support a particular issue and others kind of follow suit, that has a big impact.
Are you a big soccer fan?
I mean, not in particular, but I've definitely seen World Cup matches or every now and then La Liga, whenever my friends play it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the FIFA World Cup is being held in Qatar.
Oh yeah.
And the Winter Olympics was in China.
Right.
So these two countries have a laundry list of human rights violations. Yet still, tons and tons of companies are the official sponsors of FIFA, the official sponsors of
Sure.
China, of the Olympics. How can we hold these businesses to a higher standard that to not support countries or these sports showcases in countries with these human rights violations?
Got it. That's actually something that I went over in my business class just like a few weeks ago. What we were discussing was the fact that there's a lot of different types of companies that were once China was kind of announced as the sponsor, some of them kind of tried to get away from that country. But what happened was China kind of set a bunch of sanctions on them. On the other end, if they stuck to China, I forget which countries exactly, but the U.S. lawmakers kind of went after them. One thing that I kind of realized from both of those was and I think from a business perspective, one thing I've kind of learned here at least is that it's very much about the end customer. If it has to come from them itself. If the demand just isn't there, they will shift towards wherever their consumers are facing. For example, this is kind of unrelated, but there's a Sonic the Hedgehog movie that happened, I want to say, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. The trailer was so awful, people hated the character so much, there was a massive uproar, and they actually had to stop production, re-edit, and re-release it. They never actually released it because they knew they weren't going to make any money. So I think that on those sort of points, the main way in which we, especially as students, can kind of assist those companies with going in the right direction is by putting our money where our mouth is, really, which is by actually not giving them not buying any of their products or organizing those type of things.
Great point. And this also comes with the Ukraine-Russia crisis.
Sure.
Was after the invasion of Ukraine, tons and tons of companies have pulled out of Russia.
Right.
I'm guessing.
Such as McDonald's. I just heard that they closed all of their stores in Russia. Netflix has pulled content. Yeah.
I'm guessing this is because they see that the consumer would look at them in a negative light if they didn't pull out.
Exactly. And I think the reason why so many companies are acting so quick right now compared to, let's say, China or Qatar, I think it's definitely more of the outcry that's happening, which is exactly what I'm talking about, which is, if it was a much more small scale thing, those countries may not have done the same. Which is, but since they literally invaded Ukraine, there's been such an outpouring of support for them that they are pretty much forced to make that business decision and, take that off in order to show that they're not supporting that type of thing. So I think it's very much on this. I mean, they very much look at it as it's kind of cynical to say, but really they look at the impact that a particular event could have from that type of standpoint, whether this is something they should invest their money in putting their stores down or whatever.
I'm guessing, because companies, they don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. It's
no, definitely
fiduciarily responsible. It is. I'm guessing
Sure.
the math that they did was they would make more money if they left from Russia.
Exactly, which is exactly what we were talking about before, which is more of a utilitarian perspective almost, which is just okay, that's kind of assessing, it's just cost-benefit analysis. At the end of the day, obviously, sure, they have values and they say that. I just don't know whether in this day and age companies really believe that. That's hard to say. But I definitely think they're thinking about the costs associated with that. That could be the brand image, that could be actual costs associated with people, protesting them / boycotting them. There's a variety of different factors in there. Yeah.
So there has been multiple companies, I guess you could say companies or people out of the United Arab Emirates, out of Qatar, out of Russia who have bought sports teams.
Yeah.
So this is Chelsea Abramovich from the oligarchs. So how can we divide between watching the sport and these owners that get their money from blood?
That's an interesting question. I would say that naturally by watching your team play, obviously I feel it's kind of the same sort of point where I feel the fans have to really show their support for, we don't want this type of owner, for the club that I invest my time, money, and effort in, that I believe in. This person who's buying the team doesn't go against goes against our values, and I feel there's been moments where that's actually worked. I'm trying to think of a few. I think this happened earlier, but I can't remember where. But yeah, I guess the thing is, I think soccer fans try. I mean, generally they'll try to ignore it. You know,
Right.
ignorance is bliss because they're like, oh, I don't want to know that like Abramovich is like, you know, this Russian oligarch who's like contributing to all these other causes. Oh, I just like my team. I just watch the thing and like
Good
they
point.
think that you know they're not really supporting it, but by watching, by contributing money, they are. So I think it's about raising awareness before anything about like the sort of people that are in charge before anything.
I see. Are you first gen?
No, I'm not. I mean, like, so my parents did go to college. I'm just
Okay.
a first generation American, you can say, because my parents immigrated here.
Okay, that was my question. Yeah,
Yeah.
are you a first gen
I am,
American?
yeah.
So this question will speak to you then. So there has been multiple people, especially in this past Winter Olympics, that are American born, American trained.
Ah, right.
But then they competed for China or
Right.
Italy. So how do you feel about nationality in sport? And what team would you play for?
That's an interesting question. I would say that it very much depends on how you view your own identity, and that like is like that's a very personal decision. So I think for them, I guess they really, they really want to play for that country. So for China, for Russia, because I've seen those athletes. For me personally, like at least my identity is very much more like American. Like I feel, I don't know, like I'm Indian American, but I definitely feel more like in tune with my like American side, I guess. So I would definitely like play for the U.S. If I had to. But I mean, I understand where they're coming from. Like if they identify more with that country or with that culture, with their customs, or they have a lot of history, like I mean, it's totally up to them. So I think that's very much a personal decision to make, not what anyone else can like kind of tell them. Yeah.
Okay, so actually, this comes to American football as well. So it's the commodification of the game. That so in FIFA and the World Cup, some countries will give people citizenship so that they can play on their team.
Sure. Yeah.
And also in sports, I mean, in hockey and skiing, and also in American football, the team with the most money can go and get the best players. So how do you try to separate the money from the spirit of the sport?
It is also difficult too, I guess. People think professional athletes are just playing for money rather than wanting to win and ride.
What do they take for them to have?
I think if players were more informed about stuff that their owners were involved in, I think that's where something would start. Like if players would refuse to play for teams whose morals they don't align with and stuff like that.
Okay.
Because they're also the ones with a lot of like public, like people look up to the players, they follow them on social media. If somebody made a big stand about, stops playing for a team if their owner did something that they didn't align with, I think that would make a lot of waves within the sporting world. There would be a lot of people talking about that.
That's an interesting perspective, putting it, some of the responsibility on the players themselves, because they have this microphone and their ability to talk. Are you both first generation Americans?
No.
Both Americans. Okay. So there has been, particularly in this past Winter Olympics, where a lot of American-born, American-trained athletes have played then for China or for Italy. So how do you feel about nationality in sport?
I think that's pretty cool. If you have relatives in another country, play for your family's country. I think that's valid. I think that's fair. I've never really heard that going on, but I think it's cool. I'm a fan.
Yeah, I think kind of up to the individual player deciding what culture they associate more with, what team they would be more proud to represent.
Okay. Then how do you feel about, so that's one part of the question. And then the next part is FIFA has, countries have been willing to give citizenship to players to play for their country, which is, even though they have no cultural or family roots to it. What's your opinion on that?
I think that's pretty cool too, to be honest. I think they're doing whatever they can to win. I think that's fair too.
Yeah. It probably goes over a lot of the fans' heads then, and they're cheering for the uniform, and they're like, oh yeah, this is my country, and they never probably have an idea that this person has no real association with the country.
If I were a fan of a country that lost their best player, I'd probably be pretty upset. I could see that being an issue, but
For the country, that's a good point.
yeah, other than that though, I think, I don't know, it's pretty sweet. Assembling a better team. Play the game, have fun.
My name is Mohammed. I'm a senior at Cal studying political science.
My name is Ahmad. I'm a junior at Cal and I'm studying political science as well.
Very cool. Okay, so particularly in this past Winter Olympics, there have been a lot of American-born, American-trained athletes who then have chosen to play for China or for Italy. How do you feel about nationality in international sports like this?
Were they born in America?
Yeah. They were born and raised in America. But their parents are Chinese or Italian.
I mean, America's so diverse. I feel like there's still communities where you can still retain your full Chinese identity or Italian identity within the United States. If you just look at Chinatown, if you look at some of these Italian enclaves in the U.S., you could still be 100% Italian and just grow up in the United States by coincidence. So I think in those cases, follow what you identify more with, follow what helps your career more. I can't really knock an athlete. Only guy that's coming to mind is Nico Manayan. I think he played for the Warriors and then he played for Italy. I'm thinking he's just making a career move, so I can't really knock it. What do you think, man?
I agree with you 100%. In terms of identity, I mean, growing up in America and being Syrian, I understand the sentiment of wanting to play for your parents' country. So yeah, I agree with 100% what you said as well.
Right. So the FIFA World Cup is being held in Qatar, and the Winter Olympics was in China.
Right.
Both countries with a laundry list of human rights violations.
Correct.
So how can we contend with, our love of sport, wanting to watch these international sports with the prior atrocities of the countries that they're being held in?
Me personally, America has a long list of human rights violations. Every country has a long list of human rights violations. So it's really hard to pinpoint how. It's hard to point a finger at where the ethical question is when we ourselves aren't innocent as well. So I mean, it's a hard question. So I mean, as long as it's not Russia.
So that was something that came up was with the Olympics in China and the FIFA in Qatar. There've been all these sponsorships of these games in this country. Yes, when Russia invaded Ukraine, all these companies, a huge amount, have left Russia.
Right.
So how can we bring that same urgency of this Russia-Ukraine crisis that companies feel like the social corporate responsibility of doing something about it with also international sports?
This is a question I should probably be better suited to answer as a political scientist, but honestly, man, I see a lot of hypocrisy in how countries are reacting with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think that countries can come together through sports and shed light on some atrocities that are happening, some of these human rights violations that are happening. At the end of the day, I question how effective moving a sporting event, what type of effect that'll have on the government. I understand it could affect the economy, so it could be like a incentive for these countries to maybe change, but it gets really complicated when you try to mix, economics with politics. So at the same time, you can't always have Olympics in the United States or in, you really do want to keep these sports as international as possible. So, at the end of the day, you want to include as many people as possible without, just barring people because of the actions of their governments, which they may not be related to.
And you also brought up the point that the United States, their hands are not clean.
Exactly.
That's true.
So, this is you talked about basketball. In many sports, it's the commodification of sports that teams will just pay, the ones with the most money can just buy the best players.
Right.
So how do we separate that commodification of the sport and capitalism with just the spirit of the sport itself?
Well, I think there's room for multiple leagues. I know there's some athletes, especially in soccer, that play for their national team, but then also compete in some leagues that are more international, maybe in Europe, something like that. Example I'm thinking of is Messi. He plays for Argentina, but also, competes for Barcelona or used to compete for Barcelona. So, I think there's enough flexibility in sports for people to carry their national pride, but at the same time, lead fulfilling careers.
I mean, also that's like a deep question. You know, like the West has like pushed their entire narratives on the entire world. So in terms, I'm just thinking about pretty much basketball, for example, that NBA, how everybody from the entire world wants to come play in America basketball. So I don't know. It's a tough question. It's a long list of. It has a long list of history, and you have to really go back and dig, and then just really just like from the day the NBA started and how they pushed the NBA to make international moves out in China and Russia and stuff like that. So in terms of like capitalism and how the narrative has been pushed to come to the West to play the top of the top sports, it's very hard for me to nitpick right now, or like how to dissect such a big problem. So,
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So that's all the questions we have for the sports. But I did want to ask. So we did a Putin Ukraine crisis, and it was right when it happened, and so I was in this very Western propaganda, like, oh, these poor Ukrainian refugees. Of course, they're civilians, they're innocent at this, and we really portrayed that like they're the worthy victims. But after reading, I mean, it's not awful how we did it, but that we don't give that same respect and that the dignity to other victims of Western oppression, so including Syria, Palestine, Yemen, and Afghanistan.
Right.
So if you want to speak, when you saw this outpouring of support for Ukrainian refugees,
right,
and this huge boycott,
right,
of this hypocrisy,
right,
that some victims are more worthy than others.
I understand your narrative and the point you're trying to push. I feel like every crisis and every war is individual. Just to touch on your question, the outpouring support that the Ukraine is receiving deserves nothing less. It deserves much more attention, I believe. But just to point back to what you were saying about Syria and stuff, and just like how people nitpick and what issues they want to choose to each their own, you know. No, we can't tell people what to do and what to care for. I understand some places get more media coverage than others, and that's where the real issue is. But in terms of like coverage in Syria, it's just things have been going on so long in the Middle East that people just the whole world just turned a blind eye to it, and something new has happened in Russia, and that's honestly has been going on since 2010, but now something has erupted, so the entire world's eyes is on that, and it's affecting us here as well in terms of sanctions and pricing. So once it starts to affect us locally, you know, people really turn their eyes to the story.
That's a great point. Of course, they can be comparable, and you know they're.
Of course, right, but
that's a great point.
They shouldn't be too compared. They shouldn't.
When the United States got involved in Syria, our oil prices did not change.
Exactly.
Perfect. That's all I have for you, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm a junior, and I'm majoring in political science and media studies.
Amazing. Okay, so the Winter Olympics is being held in China, a country with a long list of human rights violations. How do you think we can contend with, also summer sports, as, you're a track and field player, our love of the sport and I love watching it, and, them being held in countries with quite bad, that committed...
Human right record.
Yeah, with bad human rights records.
I personally think that in situations such as these, I think that the platform of the Olympics is a great time to contest certain things and show your support for certain situations and for victims of certain crimes. But I also think that I have mixed feelings about it, because I feel like a lot of athletes, they work really hard for these positions, and working for 4 years only to get one chance or one platform, like that doesn't come ever so that comes ever so often. And I think that there's ways to contest certain countries without taking away opportunities from those athletes. And I think that it can be used as a platform, because a lot of times the Olympics also brings in economic value to these countries and brings in work to people working in those countries, and I don't think that that's something to be taken away because of those human rights violations.
Well, in the case of China, wouldn't the profit being brought in by the holding of the Winter Olympic be can be considered as like funding to their authoritarian regime, and to an extension, some of the horrible things that they're doing to their people.
Yeah, like, see, that is where it gets complicated, because you can't really control the money that's going through the government and how they choose to spend it. I have mixed feelings about it, because realistically, almost every country in this world has human rights violations and has some sort of like civil rights and human rights violations against their people. And that's why it's a really tricky situation to go about, unless, like, I don't know, because there could be a way to monitor the money that's coming in, but also that's a tricky situation.
Right.
Like, I think that you could say no country deserves to host the Olympics because of the way that they're treating their citizens at the end of the day.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, of course, as Americans, we're like, oh yeah, these other countries with bad human rights violations, without looking in the mirror at ourselves.
Yeah.
You did bring up, like no one else, about the individual athletes, which are an incredible part of this equation. So how do you feel about athletes who are first generation in the United States, but have been born in the United States, are trained in the United States, and then choose to play for another country of their parents from their cultural heritage? So this happened a lot in the Winter Olympics with many people playing for China or for Italy.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think it's as simple as whatever team gives you the best platform is where you should compete. Like, realistically, the United States is a really hard team to make. It's not as easy, like, it's way more competitive usually than other teams, and if competing for another team gives you a better platform to make money, then that's what you should do.
Okay, so up to the athlete.
I think it should be up to the athlete.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
My name is Mariam, also Mari. I'm a senior, and I'm a media studies major with a concentration in digital media and an intention of going into sports media, actually.
Oh, very cool.
Which is why I was like, oh.
Are you an Olympics fan, FIFA fan, soccer, what sports?
I am mostly into professional and international hockey, and then professional baseball, and then I also keep up with college and professional football and college and professional basketball.
Okay, so this question would go more for, the media and sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
So China, the Winter Olympics are being held we're in China, and the FIFA Cup will be held in Qatar, both countries with a laundry list of human rights violations.
Mm-hmm.
So and then after Ukraine was invaded by Russia, all these companies pulled out of Russia.
Yeah.
And their sponsorships, for the media covering it. So how can we contend with, these countries with human rights violations and the sponsors and the companies still paying and being willing to be part of it?
I think it's difficult to say as someone who lives in the United States and comment on other countries, like, committing war crimes, because we've committed the same amount of war crimes.
Absolutely.
So it's a little bit difficult to comment on, like, foreign countries when we are doing the exact same thing, and so I think we should apply the same mindset when it comes to sponsors, when it comes to other countries, when it comes to our own countries, where it's like, to be honest, the system at this point is so complicated that there's no possible way to avoid everything that's going to be harmful. So it's like you kind of do what you can, and you lobby when you can lobby, and you sign petitions, and you tweet at companies when you can. But, like, ultimately, like, we're in the same spot. Right? So it's like,
I mean, that's a great point. Like, on our daily life, like everything we buy, there's a Rubber gold machine of suffering that goes until we get it.
Like, you know the show, like, The Good Place?
Yeah.
Like, you know how at a certain point they were like, the system on Earth is so complicated. Like, there's no way for us to go throughout our lives and commit any sort of action without knowing all of the repercussions that are coming. So it's like, obviously, live your life to the best that you can, but, like, we're not better than anyone else.
Right.
The United States is not better than anyone else.
I agree. No,
especially in terms
absolutely.
of human rights violations. Like, not at all.
Great point. I should bring up, for Los Angeles. How do you feel about the United States holding, the Olympics in Los Angeles in 4 or 6 years? It's, that same thing. So then more towards the clubs. So owning FIFA clubs, owning clubs or teams in the United States. In football, I'm guessing in hockey it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like Abramovich that owns Chelsea in England, he is a Russian oligarch, and his money is made from oil. And then the United Arab Emirates owns teams in England as well, and all their money is blood money. So how do you feel about the sports owners being, these are not countries, but individuals or organizations that have that get their money from blood?
I mean, I think that's a little bit different because in terms of like your previous questions, like you can't hold citizens of a country accountable for their government. Yeah, I mean you can, but not completely. But at the same time, like when it comes to like a Russian oligarch that like is rich from blood money, like you can and should, and we have a responsibility to like hold individuals in power accountable, especially if they're and if they have power over other people and control over other people, which is like kind of the issue where it's like people just keep getting away with it and then we're surprised when they get away with it again. Right. So it's like if an individual can be dealt with, deal with the individual. Okay.
And so who should hold them accountable? Of course, the consumers, right? The consumers, they want to watch these sports. People love Chelsea team. Is it up to them? Is it up to the FIFA regulators? Is it up to countries? Because after the invasion of Ukraine, the UK rescinded Abramovich's visa in an attempt to punish him. So now he is trying to sell the team. Do you think this would be a good strategy for other owners?
For other nations?
I think, yeah, it could be potentially like a good way to kind of provide Russia with consequences in a way, but at the same time, there's so many people that are being trapped, like Russian and Ukrainian like models, for example, are like stuck in pairs, and like people who like have platforms, have access, and like restrictions will hit them hard, but it's difficult because I feel like the global public sphere tends to go one extreme or the other. It's we're not very good at regulating like the consequences and like spreading, like giving the consequences evenly. But I think in terms of like what we can do when it comes to individuals, since the United States has made it clear that like they're not going to get involved unless like NATO soil gets invaded, then it's like, okay, then provide the restrictions that we can on the individuals.
Perfect. I mean, your point, a lot of these questions are, how do we, about China and Qatar with their human rights abuses? But you just, as you rightfully should, and should remind us, is that the United States is no better, if not worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it also comes from like being like a woman of color in sports and being like an Arab immigrant in the United States. You hear a lot of people commenting on the Middle East and like the state of the Middle East, and it's like, okay, so why is the Middle East like that in the first place? Right. It's like,
I guess I could ask. So we did a podcast on the Putin-Ukraine crisis, and now listening back, it was very Western propaganda-ish. Like, of course, Ukrainians deserve all the, they are victims, they are innocent, they deserve all the support, if not more. But that same idea should be applied to all victims of war, even U.S. imperialists.
Absolutely, and it's just like people are just exposing themselves. Journalists are exposing themselves now, where they're like, oh, like this isn't Iraq or Afghanistan, and and it's clear what they mean, that they're like, oh, okay, these like poor brown people, okay, yeah, cool, war in their countries, they're fleeing, we're used to it, but like this is white people in Europe. I saw a journalist actually say like these are Christian. Right. I don't know.
So was it surreal to see this utter hypocrisy?
Yes and no. It's like, I know it's, when you get to a certain point, when you get to a certain age, it's kind of just like a given. But it was a strange experience to see people say it out loud on like live national television. I was like, that's a type of boldness I've never seen before. Like I've never seen it before.
And so it's exposed. This war in Ukraine has exposed this hypocrisy.
Yes.
I guess in our living memory, because I can't think of like something.
Like I feel like people used to be like very openly, outwardly racist. Obviously, it happens and it still happens, but it's like there's a lot of different people working at so many different levels at television studios to make sure things like that don't happen.
Right.
And there was no hesitation.
Yeah.
Like, that is a weird thing to think about, that they're like, oh yeah, this is a thing that you can say to people. Like, absolutely. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't know, it just doesn't.
So I mean, of course, with the Black Lives Matter movement and Stop Asian Hate, white people are becoming educated that these are actual issues that people face at all times. I think this leads us to force us to think about other ways that we portray people of color around the world, and this would be one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think specifically like when it comes to sports, it's like with sports like hockey, where there's very like black people of color are a insane minority, to a extremely, right, where it's like the people of color that are on the team are portrayed as like aggressive or fight a lot or cause issues, whereas it's like white players don't get that same treatment because they're a majority in a white sport. Right? And it's like, and it's been happening recently a lot, especially the last few off seasons have been like a lot of like racist and like sexual abuse and homophobic scandals just like exposed, and a lot of them are like players coming out and talking about like coaches who racially abused them. And so it's like this past off season there was so much happening because so many people were like contacting teams that had like drafted convicted sex offenders, like that had committed a crime like less than a year prior, or like had just hired someone as their general manager who sexual abuse was reported to him within the organization and he ignored it and didn't do anything, right? So it's like all of these different things that are like we've had sponsors like drop teams, or we've had sponsors put out statements, or all of these things, but at the end of the day it's not going to be enough until like everyone's just kind of on the same page, which is really difficult to do, but like
I agree.
We just can't do everything.
Right.
That's why we have to start on an individual level.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your thoughts.
Thank you so much. That was so cool.
My name is Madison. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or they, them, and my major is international relations. I'm my major is political science, subfielding in international relations. And I also study public policy, and I'm a foreign language area studies fellow studying the Dutch language.
It's a lot. All right, perfect. So which area of sport are you more interested in? We like Olympics, FIFA World Cup, tennis. Do you have any?
Yeah, well right now I'm really interested in roller derby, which I play. Have you ever heard of roller derby?
No.
Okay. Roller derby is a full contact, female-dominated sport. It's an international sport. There are, I think, like 1,500 teams worldwide. Also many teams throughout the U.S. Santa Cruz has a team. Portland has a team. The Bay Area has 3 teams. It's Bay Area League is the Bay Area Derby is the name of the local league. There's a San Francisco team, there's an Oakland team, and there's a Berkeley team. That's the sport that I'm interested in most at the moment.
That's cool. Unfortunately, I have no idea. This is my first time hearing it,
okay.
So we have 0 questions prepared
That's
for
totally
it.
fine. We could just talk about it.
Okay, that's great.
Basically how it works is you have an oval. It started out as a banked track sport. It actually started out as males playing the sport, and they were on inline blades instead of quads. I don't know if the camera can see. These are called quads. They're called quads because there's 2 wheels in the front and 2 wheels in the back, and that's how you move around. Inlines or blades are the ones that have one line of wheels, and roller derby started out as like a race around a track on blades, and then it became more of like a WWE type situation where these men would do pretend fight and pretend fall and things like that to make it more interesting. And Americans really ate that shit up. There would be crowds of hundreds of people showing up at these weird underground local venues to watch these men do these weird things on wheels. And then it became women started playing it. It was actually one of the first sports in America where women and men were a televised sport where women and men were playing on the same teams. They wouldn't play on the track at the same time, but they would be.
But they're on the same team.
Their points would be tallied as a team. Correct. And then it eventually became more of like a sportsmanship instead of a showmanship thing, and it evolved into this majority female sport where it's full contact now, and there's like really strict rules about how you can hit and not hit people because it's a really intense environment, and like obviously everybody has to consent to the violence that's going on, just like any other sport. And it was also one of the first sports in America where like openly queer people would be like the stars of the show. And it's before the pandemic, it was one of the fastest growing sports in America, and it was picking up a lot of steam internationally, like a lot of international teams having like these big competitions. And the women there are a lot of women and gender expansive people that put like decades of practice into becoming these really, really good skaters. But it's kind of, I guess undervalued as a sport. Maybe it's because it's majority women.
Do you think maybe like sometime in the future this could potentially become an Olympic sport?
Oh, probably, yeah. I mean, I don't see why not. If skateboarding can become an Olympic sport, I mean, people can do some of those fancy trick things like there's like park skating is another subset of roller skating, where you do like pipes and ramps and all that stuff. So like if skateboarding can become an Olympic sport, then roller derby, or at least roller park skating is like the next logical step in my opinion.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you think the sport, you mentioned that it is dominated by female and there is a lot of LGBTQ representation in it?
Yeah.
What about this sport do you think made it different from the other ones where it is, in general dominated by male?
That's a good question. I really don't know. Maybe it's the underground nature, or maybe it was like the underground nature of it that became like a safe environment for queer and women to like express themselves in this kind of like violent, powerful way. I think that like people who like want to express themselves in that way and like feel natural expressing themselves in those ways tend to just like be drawn to those environments. So I think that there's probably like the first round of roller derby badasses that started doing this, and then other women were like, I want to fucking do that shit too. Yeah, which I think is like I think that's a lot of like our responsibility as like women and queer people to inspire each other to like take on like leadership positions, to like hone in our power in like ways that we see fit. My background is in like political organizing, and I did organizing with Ignite. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ignite. It's okay. It's a national organization centered around building political ambition in young women. It's like getting young women to run for office. And so we would do like workshops and trainings, and like attach them to like women mentors and like local government and stuff like that. And I think that the kind of like nudging of like my peers being like, you can do this, I believe in you, just go do it, is the same kind of environment that like roller derby creates. Like if the women in roller derby, they seem really like scary, right? Like if I go skating around like this, like music blasting, not really paying attention to anybody, and just kind of grinding, I'm a little bit intimidating. But it's like, and all of the women in roller derby are like, there are some women that like really scare me. I'm like, I think you're too powerful for me to be in your presence. But then you like talk to them and meet them, and they just like want the best for you and like want you to get as much out of the sport as you possibly can, like psychologically, physically, all that jazz.
So one of the main themes from our current episode is the intersectionality between sport and politics. So one of our, I suppose, case study is that, have you heard of Peng Shuai?
Of what?
A Chinese tennis star called Peng Shuai.
I have not heard of it.
Basically, I'll give you like a super brief summary. A couple months ago, she posted on, just think of it as a Chinese Twitter because they don't have there, and talking about how, her affair, kind of sexual harassment, but affair with with a Chinese Communist Party higher official. And right after it was posted, she basically, like, her post got deleted. You cannot search her online.
What did she say about the relationship?
She just said that there's an affair between the two of them.
Affair in the sense that he was married?
Yes, he is married. And And then like after that, for like a couple months, she was just like not present, and like you cannot reach her at all, whether if it's on social media or through
Well, I
her
assume she
friends.
probably got silenced by the Communist Party.
Yes, that's our, yeah. And during that time, the International Association for Tennis actually boycotted China, which is a unique move that we haven't really seen before. So do you think that is the right move for them to
Absolutely,
make?
I think that was the right move for them to make.
Do you think like other sport organizations such as NBA should follow through?
Yeah, I would say so.
All right, thank you. And kind of related to that, the Winter Olympic that just happened is in China. The World Cup that's going to happen later in this year is in Qatar. They are both nations with a laundry list of human rights violations that is currently happening. So it's not just an issue of history. So how do you think we can balance, or should we not balance, between politics, human rights, and just enjoyment of sport?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that allows us to be able to enjoy sports in the first place is having access to like peace and personal expression and rights, because otherwise we can't enjoy these things that are additive to our lives if we don't have the basics. So if there are people in China and people in Qatar that don't have basic human rights, I think that it would be an insult to all of those people for us, as people in the West or people in freedom-loving nations, however you want to put it, people that care about human rights, to go and enjoy sports and pretend that those things are not happening around them.
That's a very good answer. I really love what you just said. So do you think it will be...
Yeah, and I would say too, if I may add, I would say too, especially I think that for sports that are dominated by women, I think that we have a responsibility to change some of those things in the ways that we can. Like, I don't know exactly how they decide who gets to host the Olympics. I know that there's like some like international panel or something. But it's like, if you think about it, like when Putin asked to have the Olympics hosted in Sochi, one of the reasons that he did that was to like shore up his ability to be an autocrat at home. And his regime has been brutal to people and women and gay people. I'm talking like straight up murders of gay people, widespread. And for the U.S. to like just go along with that and pretend that those things aren't happening, I think that it's just kind of disgusting. And I don't pretend to have any like kind of clout or power as an athlete, but I think for the people that do, being somebody that is aware of these things and cares about them and uses whatever amount of influence that you can have on like this broader political network that we want to have these positive human rights outcomes, I think that you should absolutely do. So if you're an organization, like the organization or the panel, you sit on the panel to decide where the Olympics are held, that is a position of power that you hold. It's not just sports at that point. That's international politics that you're doing.
And I guess unfortunately it takes it for Russia to literally invade another nation for the international community to actually stand up and say and like boycott Russian athletes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your participation. You gave us a lot of valuable input, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this too. Thank you guys for hosting this and for having me. This is great.
If you want to scan